Chernobyl, The History of Nuclear Catastrophe, by Serhii Plokhy. Book Summary. Serhii Plokhy chronicles the series of events that led to the catastrophic failure of a superpower, tracing the path to one of the most disastrous incidents in history. The tragedy unfolded due to critical design flaws and human errors, creating a deadly series of mistakes. From unqualified plant workers to leaders who prioritized safeguarding their reputations over protecting their citizens, the Chernobyl disaster was a preventable calamity. In the book, you'll discover the stories of the Chernobyl heroes, including first responders and engineers who bravely risked their lives to prevent further devastation. However, alongside these acts of heroism, you'll also see how government officials misused their power to protect themselves, leading to widespread corruption and a loss of public trust. This climate of mistrust and corruption ultimately played a significant role in the fall of the Soviet Union, marking one of the most monumental collapses in history. Chapter 1: The race to becoming an economic powerhouse leads to shortcuts. In his 1986 speech at the 27th Communist Party Congress, Mikhail Gorbachev, in his first address as General Secretary, expressed concern over the stagnation of the Soviet economy and called for a rapid shift from fossil fuels to nuclear energy. Gorbachev's plan was to shift the USSR's direction and engage in the long-running arms race, striving to become an economic powerhouse. His strategy: building nuclear power plants. However, in his haste to complete these projects in record time, many shortcuts were taken, ultimately leading to one of history's most catastrophic events. The Soviet Union's first cost-cutting move was in reactor design. To save money, officials opted for the RBMK reactor, which was significantly cheaper to produce than the VVER reactor used in the West. This decision would prove disastrous on April 26, 1986. To understand how, it's important to know the differences between the RBMK and VVER reactors. VVER reactors use water as a moderator inside the core, while RBMK reactors use graphite, which is much more dangerous. A major flaw in the RBMK design was the use of graphite on the tips of control rods. The function of control rods is to reduce reactivity, but graphite is a material that increases reactivity, making this a serious and ironic design flaw. The intention was for the control rods to give operators more control, but the consequences were disastrous. Additionally, the designers argued that further savings could be made by omitting the concrete containment structures that would typically safeguard against radiation in case of a reactor failure. The idea of constructing nuclear plants with little regard for safety was shocking, yet under the USSR's regime, opposition was swiftly silenced. Despite strong resistance, plans moved forward, and Chernobyl was built with reactors lacking any concrete containment. Chapter 2: How Nuclear Reactors Work. Before delving into the details of how the Chernobyl reactors exploded, it's important to know that by 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine was the third most powerful in the world. To accommodate the workers, the nearby town of Pripyat was constructed just 2 kilometers away from the plant. With a population of 45,000, this nuclear town offered everything one could need, from farms supplying meat and dairy to swimming pools and ice skating rinks. Pripyat seemed to have it all. Now, let's take a step back to understand how nuclear reactors function. The purpose of a power plant is to generate electricity, and they do this by producing heat. This heat turns water into steam, which drives turbines to create electricity. To generate this heat, the process of fission is used. Fission occurs when the nucleus of an atom splits into smaller parts, releasing neutrons in the process. This splitting can be initiated by making a neutron collide with an atom's nucleus. Certain atoms, like uranium-235, are naturally unstable and will undergo fission on their own to break into more stable components. This creates a chain reaction, which nuclear reactors try to control. In reactors, uranium-235 is packed into fuel rods to facilitate this process. However, neutrons move very quickly, so they need to be slowed down to increase reactivity. This is done using substances like water and graphite. In addition to graphite rods that help increase reactivity, reactors also have control rods made of materials like boron that absorb neutrons. These rods are inserted into the core to regulate the reactor's power. However, as mentioned earlier, the Chernobyl reactors had a significant design flaw: their control rods had graphite tips instead of boron. This design mistake created an unpredictable reaction, contributing to the disaster. So, how did the explosion happen? While the reactor's design flaws played a significant role, the operators conducting a safety test on this particular system were also highly incompetent, which exacerbated the situation and led to the catastrophic event. Chapter 3: Safety Test Incompetence Leads to Disaster. In the hours leading up to the explosion at Chernobyl, the plant workers were conducting a safety test to determine whether the steam turbines could generate enough electricity to compensate for a 45-second delay after a sudden power loss. Unfortunately, a combination of incompetence and human error contributed to the catastrophic events that followed. At 4 p.m. on Friday, April 24, Yuri Tregub began his usual evening shift. However, Yuri was unfamiliar with the procedures for the test, so Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov was called in to oversee it. Hours later, Unit 4 was instructed to begin the safety test, and by midnight, the young, inexperienced night crew had taken over. Dyatlov didn't arrive at the unit until 11 p.m. and immediately criticized the crew for their inefficiency, as the test was supposed to have started earlier. Ignoring the crew's lack of knowledge, he insisted they proceed with the test. By midnight, Tregub had reduced Unit 4's output to 760 megawatts thermal, MWT, which was required for the test. As the test progressed, the reactor's power began to drop rapidly, and by 12:28 a.m., it was producing only 30 MWT, well below the 760 MWT required. In an attempt to stabilize the situation, the workers removed the control rods, which caused the temperature to rise. However, they were uncertain whether to continue the test. Dyatlov insisted they continue and aimed to raise the power to 200 MWT, still far below the necessary 760. Raising the power to 200 MWT proved difficult, and with the reactor operating at low power for so long, the reactions in the fuel rods slowed down significantly. To maintain the power at 200 MWT, Leonid Toptanov, an inexperienced shift leader, kept removing the control rods. By 1:22 a.m. only 9 of the 167 control rods remained in the reactor. At this point, the reactor's water-based cooling system began to boil into steam, which caused a spike in temperature, restarting the fuel rods. This sudden power surge made the reaction uncontrollable. At 1:23 a.m. Toptanov pressed the AZ-5 button. The AZ-5 button acted like an emergency stop button, designed to initiate an immediate shutdown by inserting all the control rods into the reactor. However, the control rods, which were tipped with graphite, instead of boron, created a series of explosions that tore through the reactor in the halls of Chernobyl's Unit 4, triggering one of the worst disasters in history. But the worst was yet to come. Chapter 4, Moments Following Disaster Met with Denial. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the specialized military fire department was called in to assess the situation and extinguish the fires that were spreading throughout the plant. Unit 4 was in complete devastation, with fires breaking out everywhere. The firefighters, wearing only their standard protective gear, began walking along the roof to put out the fires. Unaware of the severity of the situation, they were exposed to extreme radioactive heat, and their boots began to melt. As they moved along the roof, they kicked around graphite chunks, not realizing that these pieces were emitting dangerously high levels of radiation. The situation worsened as the first responders soon began experiencing symptoms like nausea, headaches, and a metallic taste in their mouths. Within minutes, they were vomiting. They had no idea they were suffering from radiation poisoning, as no one had warned them about the potentially fatal effects of the radiation. For example, Petr Shavrii, one of the firefighters, suffered severe burns when he removed metal debris from a truck, causing the skin on his fingers to melt. How could this happen? How could the firefighters be sent into one of the world's most radioactive areas without proper protective equipment? The answer lies in the widespread denial at the plant and government levels. Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov believed that only the turbine hall had been affected. Even as workers began to vomit, Dyatlov and others dismissed the symptoms as shock rather than recognizing radiation poisoning. The denial continued with Viktor Brukhanov, the plant's director. He sent a memo to party leaders claiming that only the roof of Unit 4 had been damaged and reported that radiation levels were only 1,000 microrentkins per second. However, he failed to acknowledge that the radiation meter had maxed out at that figure. When a plant worker measured 55,000 microrentkins, Brukhanov dismissed the finding, choosing instead to report false, misleading data. The following morning, more efforts to suppress the truth unfolded as the government continued to downplay the disaster. They refused to acknowledge the full extent of the situation, further fueling panic among citizens. In a tragic mix of ignorance and denial, the government allowed children to play outside in Pripyat while radioactive dust settled over the city. The day appeared normal, people tended to their gardens, children played in the streets, and 7 weddings took place. It seemed like just another sunny spring day. One man, unaware of the danger, decided to sunbathe on his apartment's roof. He remarked to a neighbor how easily he was getting a tan, having never experienced such a sensation before. However, his skin began to burn, and soon he was taken away by ambulance, suffering from nausea and vomiting caused by radiation poisoning. The radioactive shower he had been exposed to would eventually cost him his life. Chapter 5, Acceptance of Damage. In the hours following the explosion, plant workers and firefighters flooded the hospital, all showing signs of radiation poisoning. Although the gravity of the situation was undeniable, authorities continued to delay action, waiting for party leaders to direct them for fear of causing panic among the citizens of Pripyat. After 36 hours of confusion and chaos, the decision was finally made to evacuate the citizens of Pripyat. They were told the evacuation would be temporary, but as we now know, those residents would never return to their homes. The immediate problem, however, was that the reactor was still emitting dangerous radiation, and the leaders needed to quickly figure out how to contain it. The first response was to drop 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, and boron onto the reactor. Helicopter pilots were tasked with flying above the radioactive site to drop the materials, but many pilots lost their lives due to the hazardous combination of flames and radiation. Unfortunately, these pilots were not the only ones who would sacrifice their lives in the effort to mitigate the disaster. Chief Scientific Advisor Valery Legasov feared an even larger explosion could occur. With the reactor still on fire, Legasov worried that the flames would burn through the concrete barrier separating the reactor from a coolant pool. If the reactor's radiation mixed with the water, it could cause a nuclear explosion, contaminating the water supplies of over 30 million people and rendering much of Ukraine uninhabitable for over a century. To prevent this, firefighters attempted to pump out the remaining radioactive water. However, gallons of contaminated water remained, prompting 3 engineers to volunteer for a dangerous mission. They dove into the radioactive water in wetsuits, located the valves that could drain the rest of the water, and successfully shut them off, though they lost their lives in the process. Additional measures were taken to prevent further catastrophic effects, including digging new chambers to stop the spread of contaminated water into the oceans. While the necessity of these efforts is uncertain, it is now clear that these actions prevented even worse global consequences. Chapter 6: Time to Clean Up. Realizing the full scale of the disaster, Soviet officials set out to initiate one of the largest cleanup efforts in history. To decontaminate the vast area affected by the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviets enlisted 600,000 men, known as liquidators. These men were given minimal information and no protective gear. Initially, soldiers, primarily young men between the ages of 18 and 20, were drafted for the cleanup. These soldiers were referred to as bureaubots, which reflected the Soviets' disregard for their well-being, using them simply as tools for the task and discarding them once their usefulness expired. Many of the soldiers were recruited from Central Asian republics, where they often had limited knowledge of the Russian language and little understanding of the radiation risks. They were routinely exposed to radiation levels nearly twice the safe limit. Between 1986 and 1989, nearly 340,000 military personnel participated in the cleanup. Their tasks included demolishing contaminated buildings and burying them under concrete, as well as tracking down and euthanizing animals exposed to radiation. The cleanup effectively involved destroying an entire city, encasing it in concrete, and burying it beneath the earth. Entire areas, such as the Red Forest, which showed signs of radiation absorption, were razed and buried underground. One of the most dangerous tasks was cleaning the graphite from the roof of Unit 3. Initially attempted by robots, the extreme heat and radiation melted and destroyed them, forcing the use of human labor. Around 3,000 bureaubots were tasked with shoveling radioactive graphite from the roof. They worked in shifts lasting only a few seconds to limit their exposure, using respirators and lead protective gear. As radiation poisoning took its toll, the first victims began to die. To prevent further contamination, the bodies were disposed of within the exclusion zone. The bodies were wrapped in plastic, placed in plastic-wrapped coffins, and then sealed in zinc caskets, which were buried in deep graves covered with cement tiles. A total of 28 bodies were buried in this manner, entombed along with the remains of a city that would never again be visited. The largest part of the cleanup involved building a massive 400,000-ton concrete sarcophagus around the reactor at Unit 4. Around 200,000 workers were chosen to complete this monumental task. They worked in the most dangerous area of the Chernobyl site, constructing a 6-meter-thick concrete wall around Unit 4, followed by the pouring of more concrete to encase the reactor in a permanent tomb, sealed off from the world and left in darkness forever. Chapter 7: The Death Toll and Its Inaccuracies. The explosion at Chernobyl not only caused immediate fatalities but also led to long-lasting environmental and health consequences for thousands of people. The true extent of the impact remains difficult to measure, but many scientists and scholars have worked to challenge the Soviet Union's official reports, which underestimated the disaster's toll. The Soviet Union's official death count from the Chernobyl disaster remains at just 31, a figure still recognized in Russia today. However, this number ignores the long-term effects on those who were exposed to radiation in the years following the explosion. Vyacheslav Grishin from the Chernobyl Union, an organization advocating for former liquidators, reports that 60,000 of these workers have already died, and 165,000 are permanently disabled. Scholars believe that the eventual death toll could reach as high as 93,000, much higher than the official Soviet count. In addition to the liquidators, residents of Pripyat and nearby areas were also at risk. The Soviet Union's slow and inadequate evacuation process exposed many to prolonged radiation. While tens of thousands were relocated, they brought contaminated items, such as clothing, with them. Moreover, thousands of buses used for evacuation came from Kiev, a city of 2 million people. After evacuating the affected residents, these buses were used again in Kiev, unknowingly spreading radioactive contamination to the city's population. The aftermath of Chernobyl also had personal and political consequences. 6 plant managers, including Viktor Brukhanov and Anatoly Dyatlov, were imprisoned. Perhaps the most tragic consequence was the suicide of Valery Legasov, the chief scientific advisor. Legasov, who included details of the flawed RBMK reactor design in his report, also exposed critical secrets of the Soviet nuclear program. After being passed over for a promotion, Legasov took his own life just 2 years after the explosion. Chapter 8: Political Costs. In addition to the human toll, the Chernobyl disaster had significant political repercussions, and many argue that it played a major role in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the days following the explosion, the Soviet government kept the incident hidden from the public. Despite the radiation levels in Kiev, just 130 kilometers away, rising dramatically, the government failed to inform the people of the danger. Instead, the city went ahead with the May Day parade, exposing innocent citizens to radiation. Even basic information about radiation sickness had to be approved by the Ukrainian Politburo. The first public address regarding the health risks of radiation wasn't aired until 10 days later, by which point the Soviet government had already lost the trust of the people. As the truth about the disaster slowly emerged, journalists began to expose the government's lies. For example, reporter Alla Yeroshinskaya discovered that 80% of children in the Narodiki district had enlarged thyroid glands, a clear sign of radiation exposure. As the public learned more about the long-term effects of Chernobyl, their trust in the Soviet Union crumbled. By 1990, it became evident that many Soviet republics were pushing for national independence and denuclearization. Lithuania declared independence, and Gorbachev responded by imposing an economic blockade, signaling his diminishing control over the republics. In August 1991, Ukraine's parliament declared independence, subject to a referendum. The vote held in December 1991 overwhelmingly supported independence, and just 9 days later, the Soviet Union was dissolved. In the closing of his book, author Serhii Plokhy offers a cautionary note about nuclear reactors still under construction today. Many of these new reactors are being built outside the Western world, particularly in countries like China, Russia, India, the United Arab Emirates, and Pakistan.